And the only reason that I'm doing what I do today is because of my background, because of all the experience that we had coming up in that, in that setting. So it just felt disingenuous to not talk about it.
Yeah.
It just began to, it began to kind of press on me. Like, this is such a, and also in the meantime, I had been through this complete deconstruction and essentially a deconversion. And so it's like, I kind of have to tell the story of the background while simultaneously telling the story of why I no longer believe it.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like we got to go out there and like get on this. There was, by the way, not really a deconstruction train to get on at the time. It wasn't, I mean, there were some people who had talked about it, but I wasn't paying attention to that. I wasn't interested in that. I didn't know who had deconstructed publicly. I didn't know much about the word deconstruction. So it wasn't I want to be a part of a movement, or I see myself as part of a movement or a spokesperson for that. It was like, we need to be honest with our audience.
Yeah.
Let's just tell the story.
Campus Crusade for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
What is that about?
Well, let's see if I can remember exactly, because I used to have to get up at the weekly meeting and say this. Campus Crusade for Christ is an interdenominational Christian organization founded in 1951 by Bill and Vonette Bright.
Wow.
Our philosophy is threefold: to win, build, and send. Win students to Christ, build them up in their faith, and send them out to continue the win, build, send process.
How's that working out for you?
Hey, it worked pretty well for a while, man.
Yeah. Well, you were pretty knowledgeable, right? Like, you would be able to talk to people and convert people. I mean, presumably that doesn't go away. Like, you've still got the knowledge, right?
Yeah.
You've still got it inside of you.
That the evangelical Christian part of my brain will never go away. Is always there, judging the deconstructed Los Angeles YouTuber. I think so. I whenever I see somebody talk about it, and I try not to do that very often.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know, just being on your podcast and talking about it, like, we get, you know this game very well. You give you give the material, you provide the material for all the Christian reaction channels.
Oh, sure.
This is what they feed off of, right? This is what they want. If we're talking about this, they want to talk about us talking about it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times I'm listening to myself say things, and I'm like, oh, well, that's what they're going to say about this.
Yeah.
And I try not to calculate that too much and think about, you can drive yourself crazy, like, trying to, like, orchestrate all your words.
Yeah, but it's something you're always aware of as a public figure. Was most of the stuff that you were doing, like, was it biblical? Was it arguments for God's existence? Was it, like, what kind of approach were you taking? What's your, like, expertise when it comes to evangelism?
So with Campus Crusade for Christ, we share something called the 4 Spiritual Laws.
Mm.
And it was a little booklet, essentially, that Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade, had put together. And it was essentially a gospel tract. God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. All people have sinned. And it's the gospel, right?
Yeah.
And 4 laws, 4 spiritual laws. It was very like 1950s Christianity, but it was very effective, because what it did is you had the ability, and of course I wouldn't like always break out the booklet. I would just maybe do it in the context of a conversation, but you might go out on. It sounds crazy when you think about it, but like, we would go down to spring break at like Panama City Beach, and you got all these kids just partying on the beach, and we were like, well, we're going to go out on the beach and we're going to start spiritual conversations with people. And we're going to plant seeds in the least, and in the best case scenario, we're going to bring someone to a point of decision. That's what you want to do. Bring them to that point of decision, right? So a great question is, if you were to die tonight, how certain are you that you would go to heaven? Right? I mean, that's a great.
It's heavy.
It's heavy, and usually if like you're in the middle of partying in Panama
break.
City Beach and you're like drunk and you're. And so many students are sort of, day 3, day 4 at spring break, and they've just been pumping themselves full of alcohol, and they're literally, some of them are still having a ball, but some of them are like actively realizing that there's no fulfillment in the excesses, right? And they're like, it's like the perfect time to approach
No,
them.
man, it's quite an existential moment, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've seen a lot of interviews with drunk people on the streets, and it can go one of two ways. There are like the funny ones when people are vulnerable in the sense that they might say something a bit stupid or whatever, and it makes for a funny viral moment. But also, yeah, the Christian outreach. I know people were doing that at my university too, where they used to sort of stand outside the nightclubs, and they weren't actually preaching or evangelizing. They would just hand out like water and biscuits and things. And I suppose it was like a, you know, it's a Christian route, but
Yes.
it is. I mean, all of the vices sort of come out in a nightclub.
Yeah.
In the party atmosphere, everything about your inhibitions, and I feel like that is probably the place where Christ enters so many people. Like when people tell their stories about coming to Christianity, it's often that kind of situation, but writ large across their life. It's like I was in the dumps, I had nowhere to turn, and at the end of the night at the club, you're sort of in a sort of microcosm of a moment like that for the day. You know, you're tired, the lights have come on, and everything is suddenly really ugly. When I was in Las Vegas, I remember I've been there once, and I showed up at night, and I thought, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen. It was glamorous, it was glittering, it was beautiful, and then in the morning I woke up relatively early because I was on UK time, and the whole thing was like baked in sunlight, and suddenly it all looked really silly. It looked silly and plastic, and my friend said that it was a bit like at the end of a nightclub where the lights come on and you realise everything's actually been ugly the whole time, and you just sort of see it, and that's kind of what Jesus does. He just turns the light on and shows you that everything was ugly all along. Because I mean, Vegas is one of the most demonic places I've ever been to in my life. Even there, right? So I was there with.
There's an emptiness there for sure.
I was there with the guy with There's a show called the Iced Coffee Hour, which I was on, and one of the hosts of that, he was sort of driving me down LA, and we went past what's the pyramid called? You know, the one that's like Egypt. I forget what the place is actually called.
I don't know the name of it.
It's got this huge pyramid that shoots this massive beam of light up into the sky, right? And he said, oh, that's really interesting actually, because you know, Las Vegas often gets these like swarms of locusts. I was like, really? They get swarms of locusts? It's like, yeah, and the crazy thing is because this pyramid shoots up that massive beam of light, it's amazing. When it happens, they all like swarm onto
it. It's like a tornado.
And start going crazy. And I was like, so you're telling me that swarms of locusts descend on Egypt in Sin City?
Yeah.
It was all getting a little bit biblical.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like that is the perfect place to walk up to somebody and be like, do you think there's something more?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I think that one of the misconceptions about someone who, like me, was a person of faith, of Christian faith, and is no longer a person of Christian faith, or you know, I've got some faith in things, but not really religious faith. Is that somehow the two alternatives are that life of excess and selfishness and like pleasure, or religious faith in Jesus. And I think it can throw people off a lot of times when I'm like, oh, I recognize the, you know, I don't see it as necessarily like, well, one is right and one is wrong. But it's just like, yeah, clearly like a human that is simply focusing on pleasures like that ultimately end up just being, they become empty pretty quickly. Like that's just a universal truth. That's not, like you as a Christian don't have a universal hold on that truth. That's not just because it was mentioned in the Bible doesn't mean that that's the only place that truth shows up. Like it's just a human experience, right? So now as someone who doesn't really know what I think about God, I still recognize like the emptiness of a place like Las Vegas. But I'm also like, you know what? Maybe every once in a while I want to go experience some excess pleasures.
Yeah. Oh, it was fun.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And not judge myself or judge others for it at the same time. Yeah. Knowing that if I take the perspective into that, oh, I recognize the emptiness of this. You know, eating at a buffet. I mean, how many times can you eat at a buffet, right?
Yeah.
Before you're like, okay, get me out of the buffets. But I feel like, again, this is kind of the perspective that I think about the way that I thought about those students when I was there with the truth in my hand. You know, I was like, there's two paths here. There's the path that you're on, which is just self-sabotage, or there's Jesus. Never considering that, well, maybe there's a few more ways to think about these things.
Do you think there's pride in there? I mean, one of the worst sins a Christian can commit is the sin of pride. and I think they're constantly sort of battling against it, especially when you're in a position. I mean, let alone some of the people I talk to who have public platforms, constantly putting themselves in front of a microphone and answering people's questions and being constantly praised. It must be really difficult to not get prideful when it starts working. But even in an outreach situation like this, is there an element where it's sort of like, not like I'm better than these people, but like, look at me doing this good thing, walking into the depths of hell and harrowing it and getting everyone back to Christ?
Yes, I mean, I think that there's an element of sort of taking pride in the work that you're doing for God, even though you can easily give God the credit, be like, the Spirit was working through me. Because if you know the code of humility, and you know how to talk about these things, but secretly you're thinking about how you're doing in relation to other Christians, and you're thinking about how they're doing in relation to you. You can't. It's human nature. You're gonna do that. But I think there's another type of pride that I think back on those times. I remember a specific instance, and this is actually after I was no longer on staff with Campus Crusade, but I was still very active in the church, and I was leading a Bible study. And we had become friends with this couple that were Catholic, and in my estimation, Catholics weren't Christians. I mean, I was that type of evangelical.
Whoa, really?
I was like, oh, maybe there's some that actually have a relationship with Jesus, but they believe, they believe that it's works and faith. It's not just faith alone, and so they don't have the grace thing figured out. At the very least, I need to introduce them to the real truth, right? And so I knew they were going to be there. And so I was like, well, I'm going to do Bible study. I'm going to go from Galatians, right? Because Galatians talks about that, basically how it's about faith and and not about works. And it was one of those things that, in retrospect, I was thinking about them, and everyone else in the Bible study, the other regulars, knew that I was kind of preaching to them from this perspective. And I think back on that, and I'm like, I brought a lot of spiritual pride to that situation because I thought I had the correct perspective and just assumed they don't agree with me about this, and they're definitely wrong. I'm bringing them in to give them the truth. When you think that you've got the truth, and it's a truth that impacts everyone, it applies to everyone, it's really difficult to not take pride in that and to begin to see yourself as better. I mean, I'm not saying that all Christians think that they're better than other people. I'm just saying, for me,
your experience,
knowing it, I remember lying there when I was in college and thinking how grateful I was that I basically believed the right thing about everything.
Yeah, well, I often parody Christian denominations with that exact thought. It's like, what are the odds? How lucky you are.
And with no irony at all. Of course, I was, a 20-year-old kid, but I was lying there in bed, and I was like, man, not only am I a Christian, but I am the right kind of Christian. I believe the right stuff. I'm in the right denomination. I'm in the right ministry. Even amongst the ministries here on campus, I'm in the one that is the most serious about this.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm so thankful that I'm right about everything. Essentially is what I was saying.
Yeah, those are my nightly affirmations. I'm just so grateful for being right about everything. It's fascinating. There is an interesting paradox there, the so-called preface paradox, where people can think that they're right about everything whilst also thinking they're wrong about at least one thing. It's called the preface paradox because at the beginning of a book, authors will often say, if there are any mistakes in here, I'm sorry. But they've gone through meticulously and checked every single one. So if I went through every single one of your beliefs individually and said, do you think this is true? Yes. Do you think this is true? Yes. So I'm going through your beliefs. So definitionally, every one of them would say yes. But if at the end I then say, but do you think at least one of those beliefs is actually false? If you're a bit humble in any respect, you go, yeah, of course, one of them's false.
Yeah.
So you've got this paradox of thinking they're all true, but at least one of them's false. It's got to do with probabilistic certainty, probably. But yeah, there's that feeling that you've got God on your side as well, and you sort of go to sleep slightly prideful, slightly content, slightly happy. Where does that certainty come from? Was it the result of Bible study and consideration of different groups and denominations? Was it more sociological, just sort of the way you were brought up? Were you cognizant of the factors which led you to be in the correct denomination and the correct student group?
Yeah, so not at the time. I think that what I would have said is that I had been taught the right stuff from my parents, and I had been in the right environment growing up. I think that ultimately there's a few factors that contributed to it. I think number one, certainty is a really important aspect of religious faith, and especially Christianity, and especially evangelical Christianity. Because I think that agreeing with a set of propositional statements is actually if you ask somebody to describe, they might say, well, it's about a relationship with Jesus. But if you're like, well, yeah, but...
Hello?
Hi, Sarah?
Yes, this is Sarah.
How are you? You're with Pacifico. We got your resume for our position in the office.
Oh, yeah?
Perfect. Are you located in LA? Because the number is not indicated pretty much for LA.
Oh, yeah, I'm in Los Angeles. I'm in the Valley.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. Sarah, do you have time tomorrow to come for an interview in the morning?
What time?
Probably 9.
Where is it?
It's in Tarzana.
9 o'clock in Tarzana. I don't think I would be able to make it because I'm actually a daycare teacher, so I work in the mornings. Is there any way I could do it virtually? Or in the afternoon?
Yes, we can do it in the afternoon. We can do either today. Let me see. So, okay, let's do tomorrow. We can do 6:30.
Okay, yeah, I can do 6:30 p.m.?
Yes, 6:30 p.m. Yes.
Yeah, 6:30 p.m. works.
Where in the valley do you live, if I can ask?
I live in Van Nuys.
Oh, amazing. So
Yeah.
that's probably like 15, 20 minutes ride, so not too bad.
Oh,
So I'm
perfect.
gonna put you down for tomorrow, 6:30. Yeah, we will see you.
Sounds good. Could you text me this information
Yes,
as well,
I'm gonna
please?
text you right now all the info, okay? For tomorrow.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. All right,
Awesome.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
After here.
that
Will
mean?
you text me all this information?
These propositional statements come up. It's like, well, I believe this about Jesus. If any church worth its salt has a "we believe" place on their website, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I thought, right? And so I think that being certain and being right about these things comes at a premium. It is really, really important. So I thought that being certain was very important. And then I just think I had the type of personality, came from the type of family where we kind of thought we had it figured out, right? Like this is a big problem for me now, is to not settle on what I think I figured out. To be really doubtful of my particular perception of the world. To say, well, I know that I'm wrong about some stuff, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm not sure about. But I can struggle with wanting to latch on to certain ideas and be, well, I've got this figured out, You start trying to build this worldview. So I think it's a combination of the environment, where certainty was really important, and then my personality, the way that I gravitated towards that.
We'll get back to Rhett in just a moment, but first, do you trust the news? I don't. And a lot of that has got to do with the bias that inevitably seeps into media reporting. We can never get rid of media bias, but wouldn't it be great if there were a way for us as consumers of news to navigate media bias, objectively comparing the way that different sources are reporting on the same story? Well, that is exactly what today's sponsor, Ground News, allows you to do. Ground News aggregates thousands of local and international news outlets all in one place, so you can compare reporting across the political spectrum. Try it out at ground.news/AlexOC. Take a look at this story about some US lawmakers wanting more Christianity in the classroom. Using Ground News, I can see that only 14% of the sources reporting on this story are right-leaning. This means that if you only tend to read right-leaning news, you could have missed this story altogether. And Ground News even has a dedicated blind spot tab, which specifically seeks out stories that you would otherwise miss based on the news that you usually read. Nowhere is doing news aggregation quite like Ground News. Try it out for yourself by going to ground.news/AlexOC or by scanning the QR code that's currently on your screen. Use my link to get 40% off their unlimited access Advantage plan. And with that said, back to Rhett. And what was this particular kind of Christianity? You said you were a Protestant. Were you in a particular denomination? Were there particular beliefs that you held that most Protestants would sort of disagree with you about?
What I would say is we called ourselves non-denominational.
Uh-huh.
But from a theological perspective, we would have most aligned with just the Baptist Church.
Sure.
So we were probably a little bit more Reformed Baptist, right? So there was a strong, not as strong as you would have in like a PCA church, a Presbyterian church in America, about predestination.
Mm-hmm.
But, we were kind of soft Calvinists, like 4-point Calvinists, and so we definitely believed that God had predetermined essentially who was his child, which was interesting to do in the context of evangelism.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, how does that affect when you go onto the beach in spring break and you're talking to people? Do you just have this thought like, well, I hope I happen to bump into the people that God's already preordained to come to faith?
Yeah, I think yes. I think the analogy that I would have used is that I'm planting a bunch of seeds.
Yep.
And some of them are sort of predetermined to grow and to flourish.
Yeah.
And that's not up to me. I'm just the one that's planting the seeds.
But then if it's not up to you, is it like if you don't plant those seeds, then
they wouldn't get saved?
They wouldn't get saved? I mean, it kind of seems that this whole predestination idea seems to undermine the motivation for going.
I really, this was probably my key, like, theological conundrum in college, because I was close with guys who were Reformed in this way, and were Calvinists, and they would be like, listen, it's just very clear in the scriptures that who he predestines. It's like, and so I remember sitting on the porch one time with my friends as we were talking about that. I said, okay, well, all right, if I want to believe the Bible, and again, I bought into univocality, and I was able to reinterpret the passages that would question this perspective in light of the ones that I had gravitated towards, which is how you build, a systematic theology to begin with. Mm-hmm. But I remember sitting with them and saying, okay, I can agree that God preordained a certain number of people to be his children, which definitely means that a certain number of people are not predestined to be his children. In fact, statistically speaking, the majority of people who've ever lived and live right now, and they're going to be in hell. So I believe that because the Bible says it. But, and I paused because I was a little bit nervous. I was like, but doesn't that kind of make God an asshole? And they were like, no. He should, you can't understand. First of all, we all deserve to be in hell.
Mm.
The fact that he would save, he's justified in not saving anyone.
Yeah, that's the line, isn't it?
And so then I was like, yeah, but he decided to create a world in which these beings would exist. He still made that choice. Doesn't that still kind of make him an asshole? So I was having thoughts like that at
Right.
20 years old, but was able to continue to carry a cognitive dissonance that allowed me to still be a very strong Christian and just be like, okay, there are things that I don't understand. God's got that figured out. That'll be the first question I ask him when I get to heaven.
Yeah, and of course there's no Christian who doesn't have thoughts like that swimming around in their minds too. It's, for some people, those are questions that they just retain and, like you say, think, I'll ask God when I see him.
Mm-hmm.
For others, it's like the first domino falling apart. I'm interested in what your view of hell was at the time when you said that most people are probably going to hell. What did you think hell was at the time when you were around 20?
I had talked myself into, mostly as a result of that struggle I was having, that it was probably some sort of, I basically became, without really reading too much about it,
Mm-hmm.
an annihilationist.
Yeah.
And so, just the idea that people who don't know God, who are not his children, will probably go through some sort of torment, but it won't be forever, and then they will cease to exist.
Yeah, and that hell is, annihilationism is the view that people will be annihilated if
Yeah.
they don't go to heaven. They sort of cease to exist, maybe after a period of suffering of some sort. I've always been quite attracted to that idea because of the classical Thomistic arguments for the existence of God, which have God as the ground of being.
Mm-hmm.
If God is the foundation of being itself, and everything that is participates in him, then if hell is something like separation from God, and if God is the ground of all being, then what does it mean to not be with God? It means to not be. It means to not exist.
Yeah, right.
So I've always thought philosophically there's good grounding for considering separation with God to be the same thing as not existing. Because to exist is to participate in God's existence, as some of the classical philosophers would put it.
Yeah.
But that's not as motivational as the fire and brimstone
Yeah.
imagery, and presumably in your outreach you wouldn't push too heavy on the hell stuff, especially
No.
considering that you thought most people were going there anyway and there's nothing you can do
Yeah,
about it.
right. And I think that it's interesting to see. I'm still a fan of Christian apologetics. It's fascinating to me to see the way that, and especially now, I there wasn't nearly as much just apologetics media as there is now when I was deconstructing, because this mostly happened to me in the late aughts and 2010, 2011. And nobody was making, there were people writing books, but nobody was making internet content about this stuff. But I kind of dip in and dip out, and to see the way the conversation around hell is evolving is fascinating, because it is a really, it's like if you've got, if you're selling a product, it's like the one thing where we get all the bad reviews about this. It's like, oh shit, people keep talking about this one thing, and it's the hell thing. So how do we rebrand hell? And the way that hell is being rebranded is smart. A lot of people are moving into this, annihilationism, but also there are people who just frame it as separation from God. It's just simply like you rejected God's love. That's not hateful for him to say, well, now you just are going to be on your own and whatever that is to deal with your own stuff. And it sounds a lot nicer. It just sounds like you're just rejecting something. And I think that's become a pretty big talking point.
Yeah. What, maybe this was one of them, but when do the dominoes start to fall over for you? How old are you, and what starts to happen? Because right now you're speaking past tense. So at some point you go from not just Christian, but really involved, professional Christian, as you put it, to now where you are. Where does this start?
So in my early 20s, the first couple of years out of school, I'm an engineer, civil engineer. I'm still very involved in Campus Crusade at the time. I'm not having that many, existential questions about it. If anything, I'm thinking about how I'm moving towards being a professional Christian, because my wife was still in college at the time. And so Link and I had kind of, we'd been best friends since first grade, 1984. So we kind of knew what we were working towards. And the idea that we were going to develop this ministry where we got to be funny and make our comedy videos, and we were really trying to find a way to do the thing that we loved for the cause that we loved.
So it sort of started as with God in the periphery here, of like with all the video stuff, and it's all sort of directed towards, at least subtly to some degree, evangelism.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was a way to have my cake and eat it too, because I really wanted, like, we are entertainers at heart. We wanted to be filmmakers. We wanted to make things that, had significance culturally. We wanted to do that from the very beginning. So we always had our minds of like, on this idea that maybe we'll kind of, we can use this ministry, or we can have a ministry where we're doing these things that we love, and then maybe something that we make will be impactful enough so that we could one day, maybe we'll move to Hollywood and maybe we'll have a ministry there just through the things that we create. That was sort of the thought in the early days. So shortly after the engineering stint, go on staff of Campus Crusade, at that point, you're going to the staff training and you're taking the seminary classes and your initial, and I was always I was not like a super deep student of theology, but I would say moderately deep, and there were certain ideas that I would gravitate towards and things that I like to think about and talk about. At that same time, I was given a book, and I never really thought about the intersection of science and faith. I think the way that I would have described it is, I think that most scientists are not Christians. Most scientists are atheists, and they've come up with some pretty wacky ideas to try to explain the world and why people are the way that they are, why the world is the way that it is, and they're mostly just desperate attempts to explain the world without God's involvement. So that whole thing about evolution and how long the world has been here, that's probably all BS. But I didn't think about it any more deeply than that. I wasn't like a staunch young earth creationist. I didn't think about that issue in particular. But I picked up a book from an astronomer, Hugh Ross. And I'm sure, I've mentioned this before, and he has a Christian ministry that is like very anti-evolution, but very pro-old universe from the standpoint of astronomy, which, obviously when you look at all the astronomical evidence and the speed of light and the size of the universe and all this stuff, okay, the universe has been around for probably as long as the scientists are saying. But then he went on to essentially say that, but all truth is God's truth, and this is totally compatible with the Bible. But just so you know, evolution didn't happen. He was a proponent of something called progressive creationism, which essentially was, yes, the world has been around for as long as the scientists say.
Right.
And these fossils we find are legitimate fossils that are approximately the date that they're saying they are. But God was creating new batches of creatures, special creations at different stages throughout the history of the world.
Whoa.
And then ultimately resulting in the creation of people.
So, why?
Great question. Great question. So, I remember thinking as I'm reading this, I'm like, it's the first time I ever thought about there being some reconciliation between what we observe in science and my belief about the world. And I just remember thinking, this doesn't feel like a good explanation.
I've never heard of somebody. I mean, I'm sure I've met someone who probably like believes that the Earth is old and the universe is old, but maybe is suspicious of evolution. But specifically, like, well, I'm a scientist and I'm an astronomer, and there's just no way I can look at the redshifting of the galaxies and deny that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. But that evolution stuff from that other field of biology that I've probably never really seriously studied, that's all BS. And instead, I mean, God is just creating animals willy-nilly.
And there's animals that are getting more and more like a person before the people.
Yeah, it's like God is just sort of doing little trial runs or something.
Right. I mean, what does that say about God? Is what I was thinking.
Yeah, it gets there eventually. That is a little bit strange. I suppose it's kind of biblical in the sense of like stretching out the story of Genesis over however long you needed, and animals sort of popping in on different days and stuff like this. But yeah, I mean the biggest problem for me that evolution poses to the Christian, and a lot of Christians today just accept evolution. They're like, yeah, sure,
right.
Humans all have a common ancestor with other animals. The biggest problem that I think it poses is the seeming like arbitrariness with which you have to say that, presuming that our apish ancestors don't get to inherit eternal life, at some point a mother gives birth to a child, and the child is morally condemnable to hell, but also potentially has the ability to inherit eternal life, but his mother doesn't.
Right.
And what the difference is there. And maybe it's just a brute fact. Maybe God just breathed life into that particular organism, but it just seems a bit arbitrary and unfair.
Yeah.
That person's suffering will now be redeemed, and it now means something. But their mother's, who is the same organism, same suffering, same lifestyle, same everything, dies like an animal. It just doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah.
Unless you want to say that personhood is something which develops as well, but that gets you into a whole lot of trouble.
And so that's where I ended up going, right? Because when I didn't really buy into the progressive creationism thing, but I was so sure that evolution didn't happen. I was like, when you're raised in the Christian faith, and the only exposure to the idea of evolution you've ever had has come through the filter of a Christian scientist telling you why it's not legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, somebody comes into your church and they're like the evolution expert, and they're like, they make it seem so impossible that you walk out of that with a full affirmation of the idea that evolution definitely didn't happen, and it's a horrible explanation. It will be debunked by the scientists themselves within our lifetime. Like, that's the kind of stuff that we told ourselves, right?
Right.
And we firmly believed it. But because of this proposal, this progressive creationist idea, because the age of the universe and the age of the Earth, from a geological, I've always been interested in geology, but from a geological standpoint, I was like, oh, well, this isn't escapable. Like, this isn't, like, the way that Answers in Genesis has framed this issue is, I mean, I'm not going to say it's definitely disingenuous. I think they really just believe that it has to, you know, be consistent with the Bible, and so they're just willing to just completely reshape everything that they're seeing in light of that. But I essentially was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. So then the idea of considering evolution, which just felt, I was like, am I actually about to do this? And I was like, well, I think C.S. Lewis believed in evolution. You know, you start saying these things like, but there's a lot of Christians who are like theistic evolutionists, and okay, so maybe there's something to this. So I read Francis Collins' book, The Language of God. And the thing that I took away from that book was that, well, evolution happened as well. And you know, he touches on it a little bit. He talks about, in that book, I think he talks about the second chromosome, the fusing of the second chromosome. I think he talks a little bit about retroviruses, and essentially, you know, we've got the marks of the same retroviruses on our DNA that chimpanzees do. And there are just these, again, there's no other way to see it.
Just like inexplicable data.
Right. It's like if we're not related to every other animal on Earth, well, God certainly tried to make it seem like we are. Yeah. And so then that was a huge moment for me. I remember coming home, still living in North Carolina. Again, a lot of people think that the story that is often told is that Lincoln and I were Christians. We came to Los Angeles. We were corrupted by this sinful city, and we threw away our faith. And the reality, and I've told it many times, but you know, it's passed over, is that all this happened when I was in North Carolina. Right. This happened when I was completely buckled into the Bible Belt, as tightly as you can be, surrounded by people who agree with me about all these things, with no social pressure to deviate from that at all. In fact, a lot of social pressure to stay
do the opposite.
So I was struggling a lot because I didn't have anybody to talk to about this.
Yeah.
I remember talking to Link. I talked to Link about it a little bit, and he would just kind of be like, "Oh, shit!" Like it felt like you're learning a lot of things that seem problematic, but I'm not gonna think of. I don't want to think about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jessie, my wife, who did come from like a young Earth creationist background, like that's that's what she was taught growing up. When I came home and I was like, "We need to talk about something," and I said, "I am thoroughly convinced that evolution is true and that we are related to every other animal. I believe in common ancestry, and I just think that it is not just, I sort of think it's true. It's just like my reading has led me to think that if this isn't true, then I actually can't determine what anything is true. It's so overwhelming." Because I had read additionally to that, she just starts crying. Because this represented, she knew what this represented.
Right.
This was this seismic shift. And I think a lot of people that I tell this story to are like, "What do you mean? There's all these Christians that believe in evolution. Like, I can't believe that this was so significant for you." But I think the reason it was is because at that point, I realized how wrong I could be about something so fundamental.
Yeah.
And I never, ever considered that I might be wrong about something so fundamental. And then, not only was I wrong, but all of these Christian apologists who were so sure about their critiques of evolution, they had missed the boat so significantly on this that suddenly I was like, can I trust anything else they've got to say about this? So that was the first big domino.
Yeah. It's significant, like you say. I mean, you might think, well, there are Christians who believe in evolution, but it depends which way you come at it. I mean, if you're somebody who's like a scientifically minded person who comes to faith in Jesus, you're not going to abandon evolution, but you might think, okay, I can make this all work. But if you've come from the background you've come from, it's like going up to your wife and saying, I just think maybe we should like live in separate houses or something. And your wife starts bawling, and someone says, "Hey, I don't really know. Some people do that. Some married couples, they live apart and stuff." Like, yeah, but what it represents to move from where we are now and the way we were living to having this kind of question or this kind of desire indicates a direction of thought.
Yeah,
which you don't really want to entertain. Your wife, if I'm not mistaken, was a student of Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
At Chapel Hill.
She was.
Right? And was this around this kind of time? Was she already being fed the atheist lies through her professor?
So, this was undergrad, at UNC. And she, at that point, this was before we even went on staff with Campus Crusade. I mean, there was no questioning of anything. Like, we both saw Bart as the enemy, right? This guy is coming and he's just decimating the faith of Christian students. And
with a laugh,
Yeah,
he comes in with that chuckle. That
so disarming. And it's funny. I haven't met Bart. I want to because I want to be able to tell him this story. Well, the first thing that would happen is Jessie. My wife is she's very passionate and she's very smart, and so she was a great defender of the faith when she was in it, and she would challenge him, right? And she would like go up to him after class and be like, "What about this or what about that?" And then she would like come and report back, or like, "This is what he said." And, and I'm sure that there are many students who have continued to attempt this strategy with him over the years. At the same time, there was somebody who was working with Campus Crusade at UNC who approached a couple years later when Link and I were already beginning to do our ministry work, who approached me and Link and said, "We actually want to create some resources to counter what Bart is doing on campus, because we feel like we need to equip students better because they're going into these classes of his and having being confronted with these questions, and what can we do like in terms of a multimedia project to address that?" So we were actually beginning to have those conversations. It never became anything. I mean, how ironic would it be if I could dig up a video of me like criticizing Bart from 20 years ago. I kind of wish we had done
That
it
would be cool.
just so I'd have it now.
That would be awesome.
But yeah, so there was never. I think that there was, especially in those days, in the college days, there was zero curiosity
Right.
about whether or not I might be wrong.
Yeah.
You know, that wasn't even up for debate. There was full confidence and no curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And I am in a very, a very different place. I think those two things have reversed at this point in my life.
Right. Right.
Very low
That's
confidence
what I
in
see.
my perspective and high curiosity for all of this stuff.
Yeah, I feel like that's been happening to me over the past few years as well, and I think it's for the better. It's less entertaining and it's less fulfilling on a superficial level, because it's nice to be able to, even when you're just talking to somebody, it's nice to be able to, at dinner, when somebody asks you anything, like, here it is, I'll lay it out, here's my beliefs, and here's why I think this, and let's have a discussion about it. It's less fulfilling to sort of go, you know what, man, I've got kind of no idea, but here are some thoughts. But I think it protects yourself against the kind of spiritual crisis which you inevitably run up against
Yeah.
when that first domino starts to fall. And for you,
Yeah.
it was evolution. You've said before that you used to kind of evangelize against evolution without having known very much about evolution. I mean, it sounds like the moment you started like reading into evolution of its own accord, you became convinced by it. How do you navigate arguing against evolution if you haven't already engaged with that primary literature? Like, I'm really intrigued when I heard you say that on some other show or something. It's like, well, you know, I haven't really learned about evolution, but I used to go out and argue against it. It's like,
Yeah.
What arguments are you using?
Yeah.
Like, how do you do
Great question. First of all, it was a different time.
that? Yeah.
Anyone who's interested in these issues now can get. I mean, you could just ask ChatGPT to give you
Yeah.
a primer on evolution. But all I had was, I mean, there was a few books, but one I remember, there was this, I can't remember the author's name, but the title was Icons of Evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of talks about the quote-unquote best arguments for evolution, and he talks about why they're all corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I found is that, first of all, 99% of the people that I engaged with about this, where I was from, and at the time, knew nothing about evolution. Even if they were like, yeah, I agree with that because that's what the scientists say.
Yeah.
But then you're like, describe the mechanism of evolution.
It's like we come from monkeys, right?
Well, I had read enough to say things like, okay, so you're saying that the primary raw material of evolution and through natural selection are genetic mutations. So give me an example of a beneficial mutation. And at best, your beneficial mutation just causes a change in color. But give me an example of a new species.
Yeah.
You know, that doesn't happen.
That stare is quite.
Yeah, right.
Quite vivid. Suddenly, I'm like, I'm thinking, is evolution true? I don't know.
Right.
Man, I don't know, man.
And so I just had those back pocket, and then I would say things like, take for instance, if we took all, you have this concept that you put organisms into different environments and they suddenly become, they adapt to different environments. But what if we were to take all of the dogs in the world and put them out into the wild? What would happen? We would have a convergence to a type of canine that could survive in the wild. And it wouldn't be my little poodle, and it wouldn't be the Great Dane. It wouldn't be these extravagant dogs that we have created through artificial selection. It would be the one that adapts to the environment, and that would probably look like a wolf. End of story. Evolution doesn't happen. And most people who don't know anything about it are like, oh, okay, I guess it doesn't happen.
Yeah. It's easy enough to do when somebody really, really just doesn't know. Because I think most people are at that position where they kind of know that evolution is this thing and it's got something to do with genetics and environment selection, but all you need is like one good counterexample or question that can't be answered, along with that confidence.
Yeah.
And those eyebrows.
Yeah, the eyebrows are key.
The eyebrows and the confidence, and there's something about the fact that you're doing this kind of professionally as well. Like if they know, oh, this is the guy who's part of this organization and whatnot, they're probably thinking, even if I had an
Today's
answer,
my day off.
he'll have heard it because he does this every day.
Right,
And so
yeah.
like there's just something about that confidence which is going to be quite off-putting for people. But presumably, those questions start to get answered for you by the reading that you're doing. And was it, I mean, you said it was Francis Collins' book. Is there a moment where you're reading it and like your mind goes to those apologetical arguments that you make and you're like, oh, that doesn't work?
Yeah, I'm like, this, there's not an explanation for this. And of course, you can do that. You can, every single one of these things, there's a page on the Answers in Genesis website for everything that we could talk about related to evolution. So they've got their perspective on the second chromosome and the fusing of that chromosome. Yeah. They've got their perspective on these retroviruses. And I think I was getting to a place where I no longer... I would essentially, I read their responses and I was just like, this can't be right. Like, they have to be wrong about this. Like, this is not a good faith argument. This is not a good faith answer, And that's when it started dawning on me, okay, I began to notice a pattern, and I think maybe I didn't even realize I was noticing a pattern yet, but this is the pattern that started then and then propagated itself throughout my entire deconstruction. And that is, there's a type of answer that someone gives when their allegiance is to the truth that they need to be true. And there's a type of answer that people who are actually interested in the truth give. And what
It's
I
not
kept
as
finding
fun.
is that Christian apologetics, really consists of people who are like, well, the truth cannot be questioned. The truth, we've predetermined that this is true, and now we've got to find a way to buttress that truth. And there's a tenor to those arguments that they don't hold up very well under scrutiny. When you get the answer to the answer to the answer to the answer, you just keep finding, like, it just seems like these people seem to be interested in what actually happened, and these people seem to be interested in the truth that they hope that happened. And that was a huge flip for me, because again, as a Christian, what I thought is, we have the truth, they have the desperate attempt to be anti-God, right? We were taught that these evolutionists, these professors who are teaching this kind of stuff, like, they're sinful, they're deceived, they desperately don't want God to exist, so therefore they got to come up with these ideas in order to explain them away. But when you're like, actually, first of all, most of these ideas came from Christians. The age of the earth, these geologists back in the day, these were just, most people were Christians. It's just the fact of the matter. And they were like, oh, God must have done it in this way. Yeah. And then when they find evolution, okay, God must have done it in this way. And so the scientific stuff, there were plenty of people who taught me, like, it's okay, you can believe that. You can be a theistic evolutionist. You probably still need to believe in a literal Adam and Eve, because the atonement still needs to make sense. Original sin's got to make sense. And I was like, okay, yeah, those arguments seem like we're just trying to marry two disparate ideas. Yeah. But I was like, okay. But I just think that mentality of finding that the people, because it got into biblical scholarship after that. It got into, well, the primeval history. So I guess this is allegory. Like, this didn't happen. These are religious myths that were adapted from other myths that were around at the same time. The flood didn't happen. Yeah. The Tower of Babel is a weird explanation for language. I started seeing all that, and so I was like, okay, now my entire view of the beginning of the Bible is different. And again, I would go to the apologetics answer, and I would be like, one person seems to be, like, the critical scholars actually seem to be, like, interested in what happened. Like, why did these people write this? Why is it like this? Where did this idea come from? And then the Christian apologists seem to be like, well, we know it's God's word, so how do we prove it? And it just kept creeping closer and closer to Jesus. And I had this, like, this happened, this was years, right? because I was like, well, I'm not going to stop believing in Jesus. You know, you can have these weird ideas about the Old Testament, but like, Jesus is different. I mean, I have a personal relationship with him, and you know, and that stuff's true, right? You know, the stuff about the resurrection, arguments for why the resurrection had happened, and it being the best explanation for the beginning of the church, and all this. I like had those arguments in my back pocket. But long story short, eventually those arguments fell victim to the same type of critique. They're a little bit different, because I do think that there's a more interesting conversation around the resurrection, because you can kind of know a little bit less about what happened. And you can be somebody who believes all this stuff about that I might agree with related to evolution, but then be like, I have a faith position that Jesus actually rose from the dead. I recognize that it's not a scientific thing, I can't prove it. It is a little bit different category. But it opened me up to questioning these sacred ideas. And it's just the most sacred idea of all, that Jesus was the Son of God who raised from the dead, eventually was the last domino to fall.
Wow. And how does that finally fall? I mean, because the evolution thing confronts, and I think the reason why it was so scandalous in the 19th century is kind of just a vibe shift, right? Because when you speak to philosophically minded Christians, they will quite correctly say, there is no argumentative syllogism you can construct which shows that because animals have a common ancestor, therefore God doesn't exist. That doesn't follow. There's no argument you can make from that. But it's hard to put into words just like the feeling. Again, it's like we were saying before about the indicating a direction of thought. When a society is based upon the idea that human beings are special and unique.
Yeah.
This idea, if you're smart, it doesn't need to undermine the idea that God exists, but it shows this direction of thought. Like, oh gosh, we're not as special as we thought we were. Where's that going to lead? I'm pretty sure that in the first edition of The Origin of Species in 1859, that beautiful ending, you know, there is grandeur in this view of life from many different species, whatever it is, having been breathed into many lives or into one, have been and are being evolved. And there's that phrase, like, having been breathed into one or to many, you know, primordial forms of life. And presumably because of the backlash that this idea receives in the second edition of The Origin of Species, having been breathed by the Creator into one life or to many, Darwin defaced the ending, moving ending to The Origin of Species. And I think by edition 3 it was back out again. So you can, I've seen one in person, an actual second edition at like a rare bookshop. If you happen to be in like a fancy rare bookshop and see if they've got a second edition, it will say by the Creator.
Wow. Because
there's just something so confronting about it that you need to respond to. But okay, there's that. And then there's the resurrection. That's not just like a vibe shift. This is the historical claim upon which Christianity is based. And like you say, it's less accessible to the scientific method because it's a singular event.
Yeah.
It's not like a process that's still going on today that we can biologically observe. And you can't scientifically or historically prove the resurrection, but you can prove like surrounding facts.
Yeah.
You can say that Jesus was crucified, that his disciples claimed to see him, all of this kind of stuff. All of those arguments are still there and still sat in your mind. Presumably you're pretty familiar with them as someone who specialises in outreach. Why would that change? Like what shifts the dial on those kinds of arguments for you?
And this is where I don't remember specifically, like, okay, well, it was this book, it was it, but, you know, it could be something as simple. It was one aspect of that argument, of that case, you know, probably the most famous one is, well, why would the disciples die for a lie?
Mm-hmm.
And then when I really looked into that, and then I found that, well, I don't think I can actually historically defend that anyone died for something that they knew to be a lie. Like, I think that this can be explained by them being deceived, right? They could just be wrong about what they saw or their perspective. But I think the bigger picture was, as I started looking at different perspectives on historical Jesus, I remember there was one book that was called The Historical Jesus, 5 Views. And I read that book, and I think every one of them was some kind of Christian.
Yeah,
Just
sure.
different gradations of liberal or progressive Christian. And everyone laid out their case with a lot of confidence and a lot more scholarship and knowledge than I have about the subject. But it was so great, and I just started. This feeling began to creep in, which was like, okay, well, maybe he did rise from the dead, but what I've learned about the process of historical investigation, and also just the nature of human psychology and the nature of religious movements and the nature of people's willingness to believe things, like, it began to dawn on me that I don't know exactly what happened with Jesus. I don't know the nature of specifically the nature of his death. Like, was he left on the cross? Was he thrown into a large, like, mass grave? Was he put into a rich man's grave by Joseph of Arimathea? Was that invented? I don't know. But what seems to be pretty clear to me is that it's almost certain that there's some explanation for how it all started that isn't that he actually raised from the dead. In my compulsion to believe that he raised from the dead, it is a religious position. It is a faith position. It's not an historically defensible position to the degree that these Christian apologists make it out to be. We were talking last night about Dale Allison, how I just think I love his book.
He's great.
And this was all like, I read that like 2 years ago, so this is all way after my deconstruction, but I'm still interested in the subject. But, he's a Christian. He believes that it happened. But I think he's got one of the best books on the resurrection. The thing is so refreshing about it is he's not coming at this from like a Gary Habermas standpoint where he's like, this is the most reasonable thing. And if you don't agree with that, you're being unreasonable. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, no, we're talking about the pinnacle of an unreasonable idea, an unreasonable event. This is not, if this happened, this is something I have to accept on faith, and I am completely fine with people who do that. But my intuition is that it didn't happen, and I have sort of lost my ability to have faith in things that are just conjecture and things that something that foundational. Mm-hmm. I still have what I would call some level of religious faith. We can talk about what that might look like, but I think that my ability to have faith in the idea of the resurrection, it just was like, why would you choose for that to be the thing that you believed in when all these other things have sort of fallen apart through this process?
Came across an interesting idea a friend told me. I wish I could remember exactly how this goes, but I'm pretty sure that there is a development as the Gospels go on about the description of the tomb. So like in Mark's Gospel, presumably, I think it just says that Jesus is put in the tomb. In Matthew's Gospel, it becomes a new tomb, and then I think by Luke it's a new tomb in which no one had been laid, or maybe that's John. I can't remember the details, but there's things that you wouldn't notice that I'd never come across this idea before. If the empty tomb is an important apologetic to Jesus' resurrection, well, we know that the tomb was empty. In order to know that the tomb was empty, you need to ensure that Jesus was probably the only person laid in it, because otherwise it could have been mixed up with someone else or something like this. And so there is this hint at evidence of an early apologetical motive to make the tomb a new tomb, which means there's no other bodies in there, and then specifically a new tomb in which no one had been laid.
Right.
So that when they say there's an empty tomb, nobody can come along and say, well, are you sure it wasn't somebody else, or someone saw the body, or it got lost or something? No, it has to be an empty tomb. And so you're right that when those little questions, are we sure that he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb in the way that it's described? And if you start to notice apologetical motivations, potentially, in those very stories, it starts to undermine the historicity a little bit. Like how Matthew's Gospel is the only one that mentions the guards at the tomb.
Right.
And we're told why the guards, like we're told by Matthew essentially why he's included the story of the guards, because they are like, Jesus is gone, and the Jews pay the guards, and say, you're going to spread the rumour that the body got stolen. That's what you're going to do. And the guards are like, sure thing, we'll do that, we'll take that money. And this is a rumor that still persists to this day, says Matthew.
Yeah, and what's the best explanation for that?
Is it like there were actually guards and Matthew is the only person who happened to report them? Or has Matthew invented the guards as an apologetical tool, admitting that there is this rumor that the body was stolen, and thereby having to invent the guards at the tomb to protect against that? Maybe there were guards. Like, we can't prove that there weren't. But when you start to see how much potential apologetical motivation is underlying these claims in these Gospels, which, although broadly seeming to be attempts at historical biography, are also just full of what is probably best thought of as mythical storytelling, becomes really difficult. Dale Allison talks at length about the raising of the graves in Matthew's Gospel at the time of Jesus'
which is bonkers.
Absolutely bonkers. But it's really strange how it's worded as well, because it says that when Jesus dies, it says at that moment when he dies, there's a great earthquake and all the graves open, and the holy ones of Jerusalem appear to people after the resurrection. And it's a really weird, clunky wording, because it says that the graves opened when Jesus died, but then it said that the people appeared to many after the resurrection, as if like they were just laying dead in the open tomb for 3 days or something. Like, it's weirdly worded. And you've got this, and Matthew's the only one who reports it, and you've got this undertone of Jesus being the firstborn of the dead. And it's like, okay, like Dale Allison is pretty convinced this didn't actually happen. It's another question whether Matthew thought it happened.
Right.
But the problem is that if Matthew didn't, this is just a bit of myth that Matthew is obviously telling some kind of allegorical story. What does that mean? It means that Matthew is willing to make up stories about resurrecting people from the dead in order to serve a theological
If it happened
point.
once.
And then the floodgates are open, especially because Matthew's Gospel is the earliest Gospel that has any post-resurrection appearances recorded in it. Boom, the doors are open.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's so fascinating to me about this is, famously, evangelical Christians, especially when I was coming up in campus ministry, like, we had our anti-Mormon arguments.
Oh yeah.
Right. There was this one summer that some Mormon missionaries, like, I was out of the country doing some missionary work, and Link was still in Raleigh, and there were Mormon missionaries that came to talk to him. They ended up coming back like 4 or 5 times, because Link at that time, especially at the time, wasn't controversial, it wasn't confrontational. He was just like, yeah, you guys. So they went through the whole spiel or whatever. And then when I got back, I was like, you let them come like 5 times? You didn't never challenge them? He was like, well, I was just kind of waiting. I ended up writing this like pamphlet. I would do this all the time. I would write like little papers or pamphlets or whatever. And there was one that was like, this is what you need to say the next time the Mormons come to your door, right? Because you can take apart their theology and their history in a much, it's so recent, right? So that was my perspective. And I find it so interesting that the average Christian apologist, the level of scrutiny they apply to criticizing Mormonism, if they would just for a moment turn that level of scrutiny on their own story, you could be like, guys, come on, do you see what you're doing? Or like, and if you had been born in a Muslim country and you were of the Muslim faith and you didn't believe that Jesus actually raised from the dead, what would your Muslim apologetic about the resurrection be? Like, do you really think these arguments are strong, or is it just you need them to be true?
Yeah.
It's so foundational to who you are, you need this to be true. But the second aspect of it is like, we're sitting here having this conversation in the context of 2025, where we have access to all this scholarship. And all this scholarship and all these discussions about these issues are such a recent phenomenon that, first of all, the tiny minority of people who live today, who call themselves Christians, care about this stuff and actually take time to think about it, right? You believe that Jesus rose from the dead if you're a Christian, probably because your parents told you. Like 90% because your parents told you. And then you got into a movement where it's continually confirmed by people who come in and they say some smart stuff about it, and this is why you can trust it. So even if it did happen, it doesn't feel like a really penetrating investigation into the historical circumstances is what's going to make it click and be like, oh, it did happen. I looked under the last rock of history and I found the resurrection. Like, it doesn't seem like God intended for that to be the way. If
that's right,
this is clearly some sort of, this is a revelation. This is like this is a secret. This is like God's secret information that you can choose to believe, and then your life is transformed. Like, I'm okay with people who frame it in that way. I'm like, well, I still think that I think this is a psychological phenomenon. I don't believe it. I'm a skeptic in that regard, but I just find it so interesting the way that some of these apologists go so hard on trying to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, do you really think that that's gonna be the thing that changes somebody's mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's what Jesus was doing.
No,
Verily I say unto you, premise one.
Yeah, he wasn't doing apologetics.
It doesn't work like that. It's clearly like not what it's all about.
Right.
And apologetics can only take you so far. I mean, there is this idea online in particular that to be a Christian or to be religious is to essentially do natural theology, is what they call it, which is like arguing for the existence of God. Like, the whole religion discussion has become consumed with God's existence, biblical scholarship, and we forget that it's actually an assumption, and a controversial assumption, that is the approach to have to this conversation. For many people, like, natural theology is just a waste of time and an improper approach to the question of God's existence. And most people who have a religious experience will report that. Thomas Aquinas famously didn't finish the Summa Theologica, the greatest Christian metaphysician of all time. And he doesn't finish it because he's performing Mass, he's performing the Eucharist, and he has a religious experience.
Right.
And his friend or colleague or whatever is writing to him, begging him, you have to finish this, Thomas. Like, this is, you've got to finish. And he says, I can write no more. It's all straw compared to what I've seen. And you're right about the double standard as well. I just had a Mormon on my show, Jacob Hansen, who, one of the key things that he likes to emphasize, he doesn't usually speak to atheists. This is quite funny. I saw him recently, and he says he doesn't usually speak to atheists because there are so many metaphysical assumptions you have to make. If you want to talk about Mormonism, you already sound absolutely mental. If you're talking to someone who doesn't even already believe in angels and God and stuff, you're not going to move an inch. But he's like, I always talk to Christians because they do believe in angels and revelation and prophets and all this kind of stuff. And he can kind of hold up a mirror to these Christians because they look at him and be like, oh yeah, so God spoke to some dude in upstate New York through some golden plates that no one's ever seen, and he's like, yeah, well, how many witnesses do you have to the resurrection that left any account? Right. We've got more eyewitness testimony to the golden plates than you've got to the resurrection, and it's this obviously I can look at this and think both of them are not quite hitting the mark.
Right.
But his big gripe is I don't mind people saying that we don't have enough evidence or you're not convinced or whatever, but as a Christian, you can't switch that off when it comes to analysing your own faith. And it does sound absurd to be like, oh, there was a prophet in New York, was there? But we've only just got used to the idea that religion comes from, that it comes from the Middle East. The whole reason why Jesus is born of Nazareth is it's like a lowly origin. They even say in the Gospels, is he the guy from Nazareth? What good comes from Nazareth? We're just used to it now. But at the time, that would have sounded about as crackpot as saying, this guy in upstate New York, yeah, he's found some golden plates and they're buried under the ground. And so I do find, I've talked about Mormonism a lot recently because I do find it holds up this interesting mirror to Christian apologetics. It's this is kind of how you sound, guys, a lot of the time.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And to have been on that side of it, and to... I mean, I don't still have that document that I wrote, the guide to talking to your Mormon friends.
I was going to ask.
I mean, it might be in some, box somewhere, but I can tell you that it was incredibly dismissive, and I think that I was trying to be cute and funny at the same time, and so I'm sure I was essentially saying, can you believe that people believe this? If you only knew how crazy this set of beliefs was, you would basically deny it on that, the fact of how crazy it was. But it's not any crazier. It's just less familiar. It's just less familiar than these things that we believe so wholeheartedly. Yeah, but at the time, you can't see it. When you're in it, you can't see it.
Yeah, of course. You said at the time you said you started believing in natural selection and your wife's in tears. Does that put you off? Do you think, oh gosh, maybe I shouldn't dig any further? Is it already an unstoppable force? Like, how does that go? Because presumably she's kind of okay with the evolution thing now. So
she's more than okay with it at this
yeah,
point.
like how does that like begin to develop? Do you just kind of keep going and say like, sorry, darling, but this is what I think, and there's nothing I can do about it?
Yeah, it moved very slow because, again, I didn't have all these YouTubers talking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I had to make the decision to be like, I'm going to buy this book and take the time to read it. And I'm still like living my life. I'm not like a voracious reader. I mean, I read quite a bit, but it's pretty slow. Mm-hmm. And Link and I are trying to build a career, and we're trying to like make ends meet. And this is early days of YouTube. So I was a bit scared of where this might lead. And I think I just had this idea, because again, where we come from, everyone else in our families are not just Christians, but they're strong, committed Christians. This is the most important thing in their life. We grew up looking down on cultural Christians. We could spot them. Now, that person just goes to church because it's the thing to do. But we go to church because this is the most important thing that we could do, is having communion with other believers. And so I think that it moved very slowly because of that. I was getting into the historical Jesus stuff in like 2010. I like looking back at some of my journal entries, and that was when it was beginning to kind of fall apart. Like the Jesus part was falling apart. But we moved to LA in 2011. So one of the things that happened, Link and I had a series where we were making these local commercials. Several of them had gone viral in like the late aughts. And we ended up getting a TV show on IFC. That's why we moved out here. So we moved out here with our wives and kids all together in 2011. And I kind of thought to myself, this is maybe an opportunity to start over a little bit. We went to a church that we had some friends at that we knew from out here. And it was in Hollywood, and it was like the music was awesome, and everyone was so cool, and they wore like the cool hats. It was like hipster church, and it was so much different than what I came from.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they talked about these issues was just more nuanced and gray. And I found myself thinking like, I think I could do this.
Mm-hmm.
I think I could do this because I guess ultimately, if you backed this person into a corner, the pastor would probably believe all the stuff that I believe, but holding it a little bit more loosely, and maybe I can kind of have this thing like, I love Jesus. And I remember writing in my journal, when Peter talks about, when Jesus is asking him if he's going to leave, and he's like, well, where else would I go?
Yeah.
I thought the same thing. I was like, what am I going to do? Become an atheist? Become non-religious? Become a different religion? It's just like, even if I'm not sure about this, I'm sure that Jesus is good for me.
Yeah.
I'm sure that these ideas are good for me, and this idea of believing in resurrection and like this, I can kind of just maintain this. That's where I was when I moved out here. That lasted such a short period of time because when I would stop and I would just think about it, I'd be like, yeah, but it's probably not true. And I started finding people who had been through similar things I could talk to about these things.
Mm-hmm.
And you start just finding there's people who have, and also I started finding people, I can't remember exactly, that they weren't really talking about on YouTube, but there were people writing about it, blogs and that kind of thing. And you just start finding, oh, these people don't believe this anymore, but they're still good people who want the same thing out of life. Because my wife and I thought our marriage would end. We thought we wouldn't have anything useful to share with our children. When you believe this idea that you've got the truth and that this is the most essential truth, and it isn't just about your salvation, it's about your life. Like your marriage is based on this commitment to Christ first.
Yeah.
Your kids, and every decision that you make about them is based on this biblical understanding and this framework. You're going to throw that out. What are you going to do? What's going to happen to your marriage? What's going to happen to your kids? But then you start finding all these people who don't know what they think about it anymore, and they like still have solid marriages, and their kids are still good kids who are just trying the best that they can. And so I think that about 1 or 2 years into being out here, when I was kind of like, okay, I just don't believe this at all. I'm not going to call myself a Christian. But maybe we'll keep going to church for a while while I try to figure out what we're going to do about the kids.
Yeah. Did that have anything to do with, like, LA and the demons of the city? Or do you think it was just, like, already, if you'd have stayed in North Carolina, the same thing would have happened?
I think that LA gave me the permission to basically be like, because if I was back home, and my decision to not go to church back home would have involved several discussions with family.
Yeah.
Whereas my decision to not go to church in LA was just my decision to not go to church.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt. So that's what I'll give the Christian critics, is the role that LA played is it did give me the freedom.
Sure.
Because we're not in a culturally Christian environment out here in the same way. It's like people believe all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And so my decision to be like, okay, well, we're just not going to be a part of this anymore.
Yeah.
Was made easier.
Yeah. And by that time, is your wife still in tears about it? Like, how does that progression?
By that time, I think the thing with her, we're in basically exactly the same place now in terms of like what she would, she believes essentially the same thing, and it took her own path to that and has her own perspective, and the things that are important or interesting to me are not necessarily important issues
it's like
to
a
her.
reverse Lee Strobel, isn't it?
Yeah.
The case against Christ.
Right.
Movie.
Yeah, and so she's basically in the same place, doesn't consider herself a Christian. But I think for her, as a mom who is homeschooling, I think there was this, well, what do we do? What do we do about our kids? I feel like I need to continue to teach some of these ideas to them. There needs to be some kind of framework. And this is something that a lot of people who are deconstructing deal with, because religion works. I definitely believe that we created it, but we created it because we needed it to some degree for the ritual, the community, the sense of awe, these things that are essential to the human experience that I do think you can experience outside of a religious community. But for most of history, religious communities have done that best. And when you have kids and you're raising a family and you're looking for purpose and meaning and structure, you can choose to like hodgepodge create that on your own, or you can plug into a community that has a set of shared myths. And that's a really difficult thing to navigate. But it's been a long process, but we found people who were also navigating it, found our own community, and I think that was a big part of our sort of moving out of it.
Yeah. So now, what's your relationship to Christianity like? I mean, you said you read Dale Allison's book like 2 years ago. That's no like, easy bedtime reading. You've got to still have some kind of interest in the resurrection to do that. Like, are you still reading about it? Are you still intrigued? I mean, what do you see as your relationship with Christianity now?
There's a fascination with it that I just think is just a natural inclination. I think that part of it, an analogy I've used before is, if I had been raised in a religion that was based on the Lord of the Rings books, I think that I would have been shaped significantly by those books, that worldview, that even if I left it, I think there's this, like, it's such a part of who I am. I think going back and reading them and experiencing them would be something that was a little bit comfortable, but also helps to kind of like, it helps me understand the way that I am. I am the way that I am. I see the world the way that I see the world because of my background. I may not completely agree with all of it anymore. I disagree with most of it. But I would be lying if I didn't say it was an essential part of who I am. So I think that there's always going to be this fascination with Jesus. And I almost feel this compulsion to defend the person of Jesus from the way he is used, especially in America, in American politics, especially. That's been a fascinating. The rise of Christian nationalism has been a fascinating thing for me to watch.
Yeah.
Because, I don't know exactly what I would have done if I would have stayed in the faith, but I'm pretty certain that I wouldn't have gotten on the Trump train, just from a Christian standpoint. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that to see the way that the name of Jesus is used, and the ideas that he is being used to support, that it's super fascinating. But I also find this need to be like, yeah, but what was he about? Like, I don't know what the man who lived, that I do believe lived, I don't know what he actually said. I don't know what's the percentage of the record that we have. But whatever, we have this movement that was started, and they wrote these things, and like some of these ideas are really beautiful, like from a moral standpoint, like the things that Jesus asked you to do, being selfless, being service oriented, caring about the poor and the needy, not just being about your own accumulation of your possessions, recognizing the emptiness in the accumulation of possessions. Like, these are beautiful ideas that I subscribe to today. So I think part of my interest is this, like, I want to rescue Jesus from the hands of the people who are using him for evil.
Yeah, because they're pretty out of line. I mean, Jesus says this, doesn't he? There'll be people who come to me saying, "Lord, Lord," and I'll say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." And there is an idea that the path is narrow, and it does just seem at times flatly contradictory, the attitudes that people have. And yet, I don't know if it's like a biblical literacy thing or what, but when you see like prosperity preachers, for example, flying around in private jets and things, and you think, I don't know how you can read the Gospels and not have this just jump off page at you. Have you seen the clip of Donald Trump asked what his favourite Bible verse is? I think this is...
He's like, I'd rather not get into this.
So it's sort of very personal, and they're like, really, anything jump out? She's like, no, I think it's too personal. And they say, are you more of a Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy? And he goes, I would say probably equal. Equal. Yeah. And by the way, I think by the next time he's asked, what are your favourite Bible verses? He's like, oh, it's 2 Corinthians 1.
Right.
He's got the
well, this is the interesting thing about that. Because I want to give, like, first of all, there are many Christians who are just like buying this idea that like he's actually that Trump's actually a Christian, right? That is happening. But I will there's a lot of Christians, I'll give them credit, they don't for a second. They don't for a second buy that he's a Christian. They know that he's using the Christians for his ends. But, and I know many people like this, but they believe that the things that he's a crude tool to basically accomplish things that are more consistent with the Christian worldview.
Yes.
And so it's a little more nuanced. And so I understand that that's what they think, but then I'm like, yeah, but okay, let's talk about the things that platform wants to establish that are still very inconsistent with the bulk of the things that Jesus talked about.
Then one wonders how much that is Christian nationalism as a whole, how much of it is really Christian, outside of just being nominally Christian, in the way that Trump might be nominally Christian. I mean, the one thing that gives me pause for thought is like when he was nearly assassinated, he did sort of quite convincingly portray a feeling of a sort of spiritual awakening after that. I mean, he put it in quite uncomfortable terms about like, well, if you look at that, if you look at how close it was, I saw the graphic of how it went just past my head. If you look at that and you're an atheist, you got to start rethinking it. And there is this forgetting of Corey Comparatore, who's the firefighter that the bullet eventually went into and killed.
Right.
But I did think, if you were nearly assassinated, especially if you've already got this sort of egomania around you, President of the United States type thing, to have your head turned at the right moment and avoid assassination, I do wonder if maybe that did make him at the very least like seriously consider the possibility of divine watching.
Right.
But don't know, even then, although I want to grant him that possible space for
Right.
spiritual growth, I don't know if that develops into, like, you know, it's easier for a rich man to throw
Yeah,
camels
I
past
don't
the
know
eye
if
of
we're
an
gonna
eagle
get
and
there.
all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But and so yeah, it's like it's a crude tool, as
Right.
you put it. And if you just look at the way that one does wonder. I always thought of doing like skits where you sort of put Jesus in the modern day and see how he would actually react, like the sort of this strange juxtaposition of the Christian attitude you're supposed to have and what Jesus was actually all about. Because some of his teachings I do think are difficult and maybe inapplicable. I had this idea of him like walking through central London or something, and somebody like comes up to him, says, "Sorry, have you got any change?" And the disciples would go, "Sorry, mate, we haven't got any change." And he goes, "You know, brethren, when one is in need, you know, if you do this to the least of these, you do it to me." So it's like, you know, Matthew, grab the purse and give
Right.
them some money. Anyway, as I was saying, and then another person comes up, "Have you got any change, mate?" And they're like, "Oh, we just get it." And he's like, because one person is in need, because you've helped one, did that lessen the need to help another? No. Peter, grab your tunic. We're going to give it to him. You know? And then and people just keep sort of coming up, and at the end, someone comes up. "You got any change?" And Jesus is like, "Sorry, mate. You know, I haven't got any change." Because I do wonder,
Yeah.
how directly applicable some of these teachings are to the modern world. And so it's kind of easy to say, you know, Christian nationalism isn't Christian. You know, Jesus would never abide by Trump. But it's difficult to imagine what Jesus would say about the presidency of a transcontinental republic in general anyway. Right? So I always find it very difficult
Yeah.
to make this kind of claim.
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons that I think this is, you know, back to the idea of like, why is it so fascinating?
Mm-hmm.
Because when you really appreciate the context for what this person was operating in,
Yeah.
you know, and you think about that for every scripture, the idea that like, oh, this makes so much more sense, not as some prophecy for current times, but it was a rhetorical exercise for what they were dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to me, the Bible actually becomes more meaningful in one sense, maybe not in like a ultimate meaning way, but in the way that we actually find and build meaning as humans based on how we interact with our circumstances and how our values interact with our circumstances. Like that's what these biblical writers were doing all along.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly it kind of comes alive to me. Like I always thought, I don't understand these biblical scholars who aren't Christians. Like it was fascinating.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
you study this for a living and you don't believe it?
Mm-hmm.
But now I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. You know, not only because it was so personal to me and foundational to who I am, but because it really is this story of the human struggle to figure out what the hell is going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Context is always key with any kind of art, and in a way the Gospels can be considered they're not art per se, but the sort of artistic elements, the beauty, the truth, the poetry, the meaning that jumps out. A lot of that has got to do with contextualizing a piece of art. Like
Mhm.
so much of it has got to do with that. That's something I clocked when you know the book Ways of Seeing by John Berger, or is it Berger? I don't know how to.
I haven't read it.
But he's got this TV show as well that he did, and one of the things he does is he shows this picture. He says, "Just look at this picture and you know, see what you think about it, and then turn the page." And you turn over the page, and it's the same picture, but it's got a caption now. It says, "This is the last painting Van Gogh made before he killed himself."
Mm.
It's like, how has that changed the way that you interact with this painting? And some people want to say it kind of shouldn't. No, the art should stand for itself, but it clearly does. Context plays a massive, massive part. And when you consider the first century Jewish context,